Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Mark Steiner. Great to have you all with us once again. So how do you really measure poverty? When the war on poverty started in 1964 by President Lyndon Baines Johnson, we used measurements that focus on food costs and other metrics that really don't speak to 21st century realities. Listen, there was a book that came out by Michael Harrington in 1962 called The Other America. And our country, it was about poverty in America, in Appalachia, in inner cities, and across America, in the barrios. And nobody in our country wanted to really even admit that we had a problem. And Michael Harrington pushed that envelope. And actually, between Michael Harrington and the people in SNCC and the war against racism in America, it pushed the U.S. government to create a war on poverty. Well, the U.S. Census now says that poverty is falling down to 11.8%. And that means 38.1 million Americans. Yet another study shows that 40% of all Americans could not find $400 in an emergency. So how do you measure poverty? Well, a new study coming out of the Institute for Policy Studies says another 100 million Americans at least are languishing in poverty, hidden by the data. The author of that report is the Institute for Policy Studies Fellow Karen Dolan, who directs their Criminalization of Race and Poverty project and co-authored the IPS Poor People's Campaign reports, The Soul of Poor Folk and A Poor People's Moral Budget. And Karen, welcome. Good to have you with us here in The Real News.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me.
It's great to see you. So, when you look at this question of poverty, if you look at this census map that they have that just talks about poverty, and you look at this map and see where it is, and I when I'm in the air, I looked at the thing, and it just, since I'm in Maryland, Maryland popped up with just 10% of the people being in poverty. I went, what? 10%? Impossible. That's ridiculous. So, talk a bit about the origin of your work and what you did and why you maintain that the poverty rate in America is so much higher and what it really is.
I don't think it's uncontroversial that the poverty, it's among conservatives who'd like to cut social services, they will make the claim that poverty is eradicated already in the United States. But for most social scientists, it's not uncontroversial that the way we measure poverty in the U.S. is undercounting poverty drastically. So we're relying on an almost 60-year-old measure that looks at very limited ways in which we decide who is poor and who is not poor. And it doesn't adequately catch the level of economic hardship in this country. And so the National Academy of Sciences and the U.S. Census Bureau has responded in the last several years by acknowledging something called the supplemental poverty measure, which is a little bit more comprehensive, and it is specific by geography, so it takes into account some of the cost of living and those sort of things, and does count some of the supports that people get, and also out-of-pocket expenses for medical care and work and childcare and things like that are necessary for people to live. The official poverty measure doesn't do that. However, even with that measure, we're just talking about family. The official poverty measure is a family of four in 2018 getting by on $25,000. That isn't really subsistence living. And even with the supplemental poverty measure, we don't get that much higher. So let's say you're not under the poverty level, you're making $30,000 for a family of four. You're not able to get by and have the kind of full life that people, especially living in the most wealthy country in the world, should have. So we, along with the Poor People's Campaign, are looking at a different way to measure poverty that really gets at that number that you were talking about, that you showed at the beginning of your segment here, about that 40% who are $400 away from an emergency. Well, a $400 emergency happens almost daily, right, to families in this country. And if you're not able to respond to that without borrowing, without going into debt, without jumping off the cliff into poverty, then you're really not living a financially secure life. And that's the case for what we've estimated to be nearly 140 million people in the U.S.
So I'm curious how we translate that politically. I was thinking about that on my way back from the dentist this morning. When I got to the dentist, I was thinking about our conversation today because they said, oh, Mark, by the way, you need a root canal right away. I went, what? So I went to the other dentist, and the root canal was $1,800. Is going to be $1,800. It's insane. So, and then I think, well, supposing I wasn't working, Supposing I was working 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet, to make sure that my kids had food on the table and I could put clothes on their back to get them to school. How would I pay for that? How would I live? And I could be making 40 grand a year and not be able to find that money if I had a wife and a couple of kids. I mean,
That's right.
I'm saying, but I don't think people get that. I mean, how deep that really is.
I mean, I think a lot of people feel it because we know that is the way we live our everyday lives. Even people who have full-time work, some people who are lucky enough to have health insurance through their employer or be able to afford health insurance. The Affordable Care Act has helped a lot of people have health insurance that couldn't have it before because medical debt is, the number one reason for personal bankruptcy in the United States. So people do feel this. We know it on a gut level, but when we see census data that comes out that says, like your response when you looked at the
census map.
When you looked at the census map and you saw that it says only 10% of people in Maryland live in poverty, when you know at the gut level that that's not true and you know your own sense of precariousness. So people understand that, I think, and we're really trying to speak to the situation that people know that they're in and talk about this is a reality for nearly 40% of us. And even above that, so maybe above the 40%, you could afford a $400 emergency, but you might not be able to afford an $1,800 root canal. So that's going to capture even a lot more people.
So, when you look at these charts that talk about the cost of medical care and the amount of people who have lost medical care in this country over the last couple of years, it's actually pretty stunning. I mean, there are more and more people, especially communities of color, foreign-born, that do not have health insurance. It's just rising exponentially, going towards 20%, as we can see from this chart. And, I think that these are the kind of factors that were not always taken into account when we talked about how you measure poverty, how you define what poverty means. Because I think most people in this country, Karen, even if they are in that area where they are tight for money, can't find the $400, and we're talking about hundreds of millions, 140, 50 million people, maybe more. You can tell us better about that. Is that people don't want to think of themselves in poverty either, because it's such a stigma.
There's a stigma, and that's also what the Poor People's Campaign and the reports that we have put out and the message that we're trying to put out, that is a deliberate attempt. So there's not only an attempt to hide the poor, there's also an attempt there always has been, to stigmatize the poor as if it's a character fault. But of course, it's not a character fault. It's not laziness. People who are struggling to get by are working 2, 3, 4 jobs. So they're extremely hardworking people. These are systemic problems. So these are systemic problems in the wealthiest nation in the world. That is a choice. It is a political choice that we have so many people in poverty and so many low-income people struggling to get by. We need to make different choices. We can, for instance, cut the military budget by $350 billion and afford Medicare for all. We can have a fair taxation policy on the wealthy and corporations and closing loopholes. And we can get $900 billion out of that. We can get billions of dollars of switching to clean energy and stopping subsidies for fossil fuels. So the Poor People's Campaign and the reports that we have written on the moral budget and on the souls of poor folk, it looks at those interlocking oppressions, how they are systematic, how they are political choices, and how we can make different political choices so that people are not stigmatized, but so that we have chosen to have a society in which everyone can thrive.
Right, and so politically, I mean, I wonder how that gets pushed. I mean, you have Trump saying, because of his thing called the Chain Consumer Price Index, which I had no idea what that meant until I read the article, that where they measure poverty and poverty is less. So he talks about poverty going down in his administration, not going up. Your reality, you're painting for where America is much broader than that. So the question becomes how to explain to people about what you're saying as is a depth of poverty, and have people see that, given there's this huge push on the other side saying it's not as great as it was, that it's actually going down.
I think that people aren't going to fall for this sort of sleight of hand of, oh, magically we're going to count poverty differently, right? So the change consumer price index would say, oh, the price of gas goes up. So instead of driving gas guzzlers, a person's going to go out and buy an electric car. Well, that doesn't work for people that don't have the
Right.
kind of money.
After you pay for $1,800 to get your root canal done, then you go out and buy a Prius because your car costs you money. You can't afford
That's
the
right.
gas. Right.
That's right. So people that are struggling cannot change their consumer habits in that way, and people do know that. You'll also see it, though. You see in polling data, you see a huge support for Medicare for all, for instance. You see that people understand the unfairness of all the tax cuts going to the wealthy at the expense of the rest of us. So there's a fundamental sense of justice where I think that people aren't going to be fooled by these tricks from conservatives. And conservatives want to have it both ways. They'll say, oh, the war on poverty hasn't worked. These social safety net programs haven't worked. Yet they also want to say, oh, there's no poverty at all. So which one is it? I mean, both of the stories are false on their face. And these are our lived realities. So we know what these are. We know fundamentally that many of the economic systems are rigged in this country. We know who's benefiting and who isn't, because the vast majority of us aren't. And so just treading water and just getting by isn't the kind of future we want for our children. So these are very, bread and butter issues that are very important to all Americans. So when you see some of these proposals from, say, a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren, populists, that have the message about how we can all thrive and how we all can have a more just and fair society. That does attract people. People are attracted to that. They're very taken by Reverend Barber and Reverend Liz Theo Harris and the Poor People's Campaign. That's now in 43 states, and they're in a bus tour across the country. And people are really paying attention. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez last week, in the midst of all this impeachment hoopla, dropped announced a program, the Just Society program, and it has 5 very ambitious bills to attack poverty at its roots. So the more that we're looking at the systemic causes of poverty, the more we're talking out loud of getting presidential candidates and other lawmakers to speak about the systemic causes of poverty, get rid of that stigma, get rid of that myth that it is a character flaw in individuals, then people understand it because they're living it. And by the way, the Poor People's Campaign also, makes a point of pointing out that the vast majority of poor people in the United States are white. It disproportionately affects people of color, but the vast majority of poor people are white. This has become a racialized issue, especially under Reagan, but goes back before Reagan, but the whole so-called welfare queen, these myths that attack people's character and become very racialized. So the Poor People's Campaign and our work tries to look at these interlocking oppressions of mass incarceration, denying voting rights, assaulting our democracy, bloated Pentagon budgets, not paying attention, not just paying attention to helping the climate, but actually hurting the climate and climate injustice by having pollution and leaded water and toxic chemicals in schools and poor communities, at the same time propping up the very polluting corporations that are hurting most of us.
And, I think that this, what you're saying, is really important. I think connecting those dots is really important as we face this moment with this impeachment process. We forget that it's issues like this that can push an agenda to change America, and they can get lost in all the other rhetorical battles of the moment. And I think that's really important to understand. And Karen Dolan, I do appreciate the work you do a great deal, and thank you so much for taking your time here with The Real News today. And I look forward to really many more in-depth conversations with you, Reverend Barber, Liz Theo Harris, and others, to really kind of get under this issue for Americans to really grasp who we are, what we're facing, and how we can change it. So thanks for your work, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark.
It's always a pleasure. And I'm Mark Steinreich here for the Real News Network. Thank you all for joining us. Please let us know what you think. Go on our website and, just send us a message. I'd like to hear from you. Take care.
Hey y'all, my name is Tharna Noor and I'm a climate crisis reporter here at the Real News Network. This is a crucial moment for humanity and for the planet. So if you like what we do, please support us by subscribing at the link below. Thank you.